Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming out on this pre-Thanksgiving event. So we're very grateful you're here. My name is John Shaw. I'm the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. And we're especially delighted to be joining a Congresswoman from a nearby district, Nikki Budzinski. The Congresswoman has had a really interesting career, which we're going to talk about. And the format will be, I'll spend some time talking with her about her career, where she grew up, where she studied, the political involvement she's had, and of course what's going on now in Washington and the key issues that she is working on. So we're going to talk for a while and then open it up for questions and look forward to a really terrific conversation. So thank you so much. I think we're okay with the microphone here. Well, Nikki, I should say, is a fellow Peorian. So tell us about growing up in Peoria.
Well, the funny thing, I was born in Peoria. We moved around quite a bit, actually. And so I kind of grew up in Orlando, Florida. I went to high school in Virginia. But what rooted us and rooted my family was the state of Illinois. So my dad was born in Peoria. My sister was born in Peoria. We ended up moving back to Peoria. And that's where we've called home for at least the last 25 years. But that's where my first 5 years of my life started. I spent every summer going back to Peoria to visit my grandparents, who I spend a lot of time talking about now on the campaign trail, and my other set of grandparents that lived in Dixon, Illinois, in northern Illinois, but a smaller town, but spent a lot of summers in Illinois. And Peoria is still, a very special place to me. As you know, the political adage, if it plays in Peoria, it'll play anywhere. I think that's very true. I think that's very true for a lot of downstate Illinois, but has certainly grounded me in how I look at the world.
Well, let's talk about one set of grandparents, because I think maybe your paternal grandparents, where your dad was a painter, or grandfather, a painter for District 150, and then your grandmother was a school teacher. So talk about maybe their broader influence, and also maybe how that shaped some of your interests in, we'll be talking about labor and some of your interests in the labor movement.
Definitely. So my grandfather, who was a union painter in Peoria, they were a couple, they owned a very small house that had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. They had an Oldsmobile. They did not have a credit card. They took out every week the cash that they were going to use for everything they could buy in that week. They didn't write checks. But because what I saw, my grandmother did not work. She stayed home with my dad and my uncle. But my grandfather, because of his union, because he had a pension, he was actually able to retire at 60. He died pretty young at 69, but what that pension meant is that for the last 9 years of his life, he really enjoyed a retirement. And again, I think in some ways, what it taught me is not just about a retirement with dignity, but making a good wage. He had a college, not a college degree. He only was educated to the age of 17. My grandmother was educated to the age of 16. So these are folks that by today's standards, would really be struggling, I think, to find a good wage, a good middle-class lifestyle. But what I saw because of my grandfather's union membership was basically a pass into the middle class, and that allowed them to own the car, the house, and provide a very modest but a happy life. And I really directly attribute that to what I saw in his union membership there in Peoria. My grandmother on my mom's side was a public school teacher. My grandfather on my mom's side also was a public school teacher. He became a superintendent of schools eventually up in Dixon, Illinois. But what I learned through them was the value of public education. And I still to this day am a very, very big supporter of making sure that we're fully funding public education, but that we're supporting our public school teachers as well. in the unique work that they do. I mean, I think the job of public school teaching has probably changed significantly since when my grandmother taught. She taught deaf children, children with special needs. You know, today, I think teachers are now kind of pseudo-parents, social workers, nurses. They're providing meals to their students, wearing a lot more hats. But I think what I learned from my grandparents on my mom's side was just the value of a good public education. They also taught me that, you know, there was this expectation of going to college for them. They thought that that was a really important next step for us. I actually have spent a lot of my career now in Congress talking about how that's not the only path, and I do very much believe that that's not the only path to the middle class. I think union apprenticeships and other trades work can be a great profession, but because of my grandparents and their work in public education, they really grounded that as something that was important for communities, for society, for all of us.
And then your mom was a bit of a political, activist, but she was part of the League of Women Voters and was very taking you to candidate forums and that sort of thing. Talk about how that shaped you.
Yeah, I think both of my parents taught me about why it's important to be involved in your community, to just be civically engaged and an educated citizen. My mom has always been very passionate about the League of Women Voters. Of course, she's the one that, you know, talked to me about being a Democrat and the importance of being a member of the Democratic Party. But she very much believes in, voter participation, the right to vote, and how important that is, and how that's really a responsibility that each of us have that we need to exercise, is getting out to vote. So she still is very active with the League of Women Voters. She was the president of the Peoria League of Women Voters and has been on the State League of Women Voters board, continues to care a lot about that. My dad found activism actually more through a jobs reentry program at the local Peoria County Jail. My dad is very involved in the Catholic Church, and through that work, they started a reentry program at the Peoria County Jail, which he is still very engaged in and cares a lot about that program. But I think they both, in their own different ways, kind of taught me the value of being active in your community, giving back to your community, and finding the issues that you care about and being committed to them.
U of I, how did, were you a political science major? Were you a student government person? Talk about your time at U of I.
Yeah, shocking, I was a political science major. I was political science and also history. I was the president of the College Democrats at the University of Illinois, another shocking bit of news for everyone. But I will say, I talk about how I became an activist. It really was on my college campus. It was about registering students to vote. At that time, we were talking about things like motor voter laws, where you'd be able to register as a student at a DMV. DMVs actually were a site that made it easier to register to vote. Now, of course, in the state of Illinois, we have same-day registration, and you can register at a polling site, which is very different. But we were always trying to advocate to students on campus that you should care about what's happening in your community on your campus, and we try to get students to register to vote on campus versus maybe voting from home. But at that time, it's really funny, in college, that's when I first met our state treasurer, Mike Frericks, is a very good friend of mine. At that time, he was running for the state house, and so I met him when I was in college, and some other people that are still very involved in the university, but we were all kind of college Democrats, student government nerds at the time. But I loved being involved in the campus.
No, I know you had a couple influential internships, one with Richard Gephardt, and then also Paul Simon. So talk about, were those during college or shortly after college?
They were after college, or I'm sorry, they were during college. They were after high school. My first internship was immediately after high school. I interned for Congressman Richard Gephardt. I think at that time, would you have told me I'd be representing the district that was on the other side of the Mississippi from him, I just would have never believed it. But this was in 1994, and it was very interesting because it was when Democrats had moved after the contract with America. They'd moved into the minority. So now Gephardt was the minority leader. So what is kind of wild to me is when I go into Hakeem Jeffrey's office, he is now in what was Congressman Gephardt's office when I interned for him. So I mean, I remember the space. I remember being an intern and how formidable it was. I used to take notes for him, like dictate the notes from when he would do radio interviews in his office. And so I had interned for him in his communication shop, but I just loved it. It was such a cool experience to be in the Capitol. And then, of course, you mentioned, John, that I interned for Senator Simon. Senator Simon is kind of the elected official that if you were to ask me, like, who do I emulate? I mean, to me, he was this great, plain-spoken, normal person, but with values and integrity, and cared so much about the state of Illinois, a Southern Illinoisan from McCanda, but also progressive in a lot of interesting ways that I just think he was so unique. And so in 1996, I was in college. I got the opportunity to intern for him. And we kept in touch after my internship, actually. I hadn't been elected to the College Democrats. I wrote him after my internship, not knowing if anybody's going to write me back. He always wrote me back. And he wrote me a note after I'd been elected to say, like, they chose wisely. He was always very encouraging. And I kept every single one of those notes. So it's really, really, really neat.
Now, your first early part of your career was in the labor movement. Tell us about how obviously your grandfather, but how did you gravitate into that world? And because I think it's interesting to kind of reflect a little bit later about just how many Democrats have drifted away from organized labor as it's contracted. But what was your initial involvement, and what sort of jobs did you have?
So I would say, my family experience definitely gave me exposure to the importance of the movement. But I do want to give a shout out to Betty Smith, who's in the front row, because her husband, Ed Smith, there's probably no one more transformative for me or formidable to me in my career than Ed. And loved Ed. And Ed was a giant in Southern Illinois, a tremendous labor leader, somebody that just cared very deeply about working people. And so I had been somebody who'd worked on a lot of political campaigns. And if you work in Democratic politics, you meet a lot of labor leaders along the way, if you're on the right campaigns. And I had the opportunity to meet Ed, and Ed and Betty, kind enough, took me into their home when I was working on John Kerry's race in the state of Missouri, and lived with them. And after Kerry lost, I thought, I really wanted to belong to some movement that really was bigger than any one campaign cycle, right? That was doing good work for working people. And Ed had given me my first opportunity working at the Laborers International in Washington. I worked there for a bit. I ended up joining the Firefighters Union and worked there for 3 years. And then I joined the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and worked there for 7 years. And I often say now that I've been elected to office, I'm one of the few members of Congress you'll meet that has actually been on a kill floor. I've seen the hard work that working people do and the things that ensure that they come home safely at night. In a lot of these really dangerous jobs were the benefits that were negotiated in their union contract. And that made sure that they had safe working conditions, but that they had opportunities that my grandfather had, which was a good wage, a good benefits, and a pension, a retirement that they could fall back on. And I really fell in love with the labor movement. I was there through, and I would just say, I worked in the movement in 2010. It was a very formidable time, I think, in the movement, because this was when a lot of the Midwestern states were moving toward the Republicans. So Scott Walker was elected in Wisconsin. There were some really bad anti-union laws that had passed in the Midwest. And so being a part of those rallies and organizing for workers' rights and what it meant to have a seat at the table to negotiate with your employer for good wages and benefits, I still believe to this day there's nothing that counterweights the corporate interests in our country other than the labor movement in an organized way, in a funded way, even still to this day. And so, I worked, working for them for 10 years, and in a variety of different ways. So for the firefighters, they're obviously a very different union than the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, which are mostly the meat packers and retail workers. But firefighters face a lot of other different challenges as it relates to training and equipment. And so being able to just help advocate for them at the state and the federal level and work with them and to see their lives and the difference that the union was making was very powerful. And it really is my North Star now in Congress as to the issues that I care the most about taking up and fighting for. Very foundational.
You worked for Governor Pritzker in his campaign in 2018, and then the White House for President Biden. I'm eager to get back to your district, but talk a little bit about some of your reflections for working with Governor Pritzker, and then also President Biden. You were the chief of staff of his budget office during the early years of his first year. The first year. So interestingly, I started with Governor Pritzker actually after I had worked in Brooklyn on Hillary Clinton's campaign. And when she lost, I knew I wanted to come home. And I had some mutual friends of the governor's that had introduced me to him. And at that time, they had just said, this guy named Governor, or at that time JB, just wanted to be kind of taken around the state, figure out if he wanted to run for governor. He didn't know. And so I was the first person that he hired in January of 2018. No, 2017. Sorry, my dates get mixed up. But the year before, just that year right after the presidential, anyways, took him around, brought him to places like Southern Illinois, brought him to places like Collinsville, Decatur. And I really, and I still to this day think he is an incredible retail politician. There's nobody that's going to outwork a room more than JB Pritzker. He loves people. He cares very deeply about his state. And I really enjoyed working for him during his campaign and helping. I served as his senior advisor, helping to get him elected. And part of my focus was downstate Illinois, which is a kind of a joke in Illinois. Of our 102 counties, that's 96 of them. So had a big terrain. But we did a lot of bus tours. Ed was a part of every single one of them. When I worked for him then, after he was elected, I got the opportunity to run the transition. So when we were moving from Governor Rauner's administration and JB was coming in, which was a very interesting perspective, and that's actually how I met Governor Jim Edgar, because Governor Edgar served as the chair of our transition committee when Governor Pritzker had gotten elected. But it was fascinating, and I would tell you too, I fell in love with state government. I mean, I really thought how do you build the next incoming administration, especially when a Republican administration is leaving and a new incoming Democratic administration? You've got to hire all new directors. There's a lot of staff you'll keep. There are new people you need to bring on. How we navigated all of that was a really great learning experience for me into state government. And then, of course, I went in for the first year of his term, and
I tell you still to this day, the thing I'm the most proud of, or one of the things I'm the very most proud of in my career, is helping him to pass the $15 minimum wage in the state of Illinois. This had been something that had been tried many, many times. But I thought that this was a promise that the governor had made, and I really kind of proposed to him that this is something we should do differently, not wait. As you know, John, you wait until the end of a legislative session, which is in May, to do big ticket items like passing a minimum wage. We decided to move it up and to try to lead with it. And the governor, with his leaning in and working with the House and the Senate, we were able to have him sign that into law in February, which is pretty uncommon because it was so much earlier. And it allowed us to do a lot of other things in that first year, I think, like Rebuild Illinois, which is still the biggest infrastructure project the state of Illinois has ever had. They legalized cannabis. There were a number of really big accomplishments that happened for the governor in that first year of his first term. And so I was really proud to be a part of that. But I learned so much about state government that I didn't know from that experience. I ended up kind of wanting to then choose a different path and go out and do other work after that, and which eventually led me to serving as the chief of staff at the Office of Management and Budget. I did not know at that time, but kind of helping to run the transition from Governor Rauner to Governor Pritzker was very helpful when I came in for President Biden, because the Trump administration, when they were leaving their first term, did not believe that they should have been leaving. And so it wasn't until January 21st of 2021, which was the day that President Biden was sworn into office, did they really turn the keys over to any office. That's actually pretty unheard of, because for all of the faults I could share with you that I feel about Governor Rauner, his team really did help us in that transition. They worked with us, the Department of Corrections, DCFS, they sat down with us, they shared with us, these are problems you're going to be facing on day one, and for the state of Illinois, you need to be ready for this. That was really appreciated. But when you had President Biden taking office and literally they kind of toss you the keys on the first day, it was really challenging. And I would say some of the things that linger with me the most and still weigh heavy on me now because of what is happening in the second term of the Trump administration is the real trauma that the federal workforce had been through at the end of the first Trump administration. And why I say that is during COVID, there were many stories of the federal workforce having to still come into office. They were kind of bullied into not wearing masks in closed spaces. And this was a time when a lot of people didn't know how you were transmitting COVID. I remember there was a time where people were leaving their groceries outside to see if that would prevent it from being carried into their homes. So this was a really scary time. And the Trump folks really, I think, left a lot of trauma with the career, the civil servants that really stay on in continuity in the federal government. So helping to rebuild morale was a really big thing at OMB. But OMB's importance, and we're seeing this now with Russ Vought, interesting, the current OMB director, Russ Vought, was the OMB director when we came in. He was the last OMB director. So I have a feeling for how, that place is probably operating under a lot of fear, I would say. But, it's the nerve center of the federal government. It's where all federal regulations come through. It's where all of the federal budget, the president's federal budget, is put together. It's really an amazing, and that's why I say it's the nerve center of the federal government. It is a very interesting place to work, and fantastic civil servants that do that work to support the administration.
Well, you came back to Illinois and decided to run in the 13th district, which is one of the most interesting districts geographically in the country, I think you could say. And I saw an interview you did in which someone was teasing you or challenging you a little bit about the district, and you said, "Look, I didn't write the lines, I just ran and won the seat." So for people who maybe are not so familiar, why don't you sketch out what the 13th district looks like?
Yeah, the 13th district, it's funny. Stephen Colbert likened it to a scorpion tail, but it basically goes all the way across central Illinois. The most southern part of it is East St. Louis, but it takes in most of St. Clair and Madison County. I represent almost all of Macoupin County. I live in Springfield, so it goes through Springfield, it touches and goes through Decatur, and then also includes Urbana-Champaign. So I get to represent my alma mater, which is cool. But it almost runs from the Indiana state line to the Missouri state line.
And it's 7 counties it goes through, is that right?
Yeah, 7 counties, and I share 6 of those 7 counties with Congresswoman Mary Miller. I share the 7th county with Congressman Mike Bost. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what you do in Washington. You're on a couple of important committees. I mean, the House Agriculture Committee does a farm bill periodically. Talk about the House Ag Committee and what it works on primarily and what you are most interested.
Yeah, I really love the House Agriculture Committee, I will say. I think it's a very unique place typically. I'll say typically. Right now is a very interesting time in Washington, but it typically is a very bipartisan committee where we do a lot of good policy work. And oftentimes, it's not the place where you're going to get into a Twitter fight, with a colleague, which I personally like. That's not my style, but we've been working on a farm bill since I came to Congress, which was in 2022. The most recent continuing resolution that just passed to reopen government, it included another 1-year extension on the farm bill, but I often say that's just kind of kicking the can down the road. It doesn't really address what I think is a really important time for agriculture. I think the farm economy has been really teetering on the point of crisis. I hear the 1980s used a lot now with farmers when we're talking about the prices of where corn and soybean is right now versus where input prices are versus the turmoil that's happening with tariffs and market access. And so I do worry right now on the committee that we're seeing a lot of missed opportunity. One of the spaces, though, that has been kind of a bright light, and I got to visit with Dean Boone here in the School of Agriculture. We, too, are very involved in biomanufacturing and fermentation, and I know SIU is also leading in that space. Some of our community colleges, Parkland and Richland, and then the University of Illinois are also doing it. So I joke that my district is actually Silicon Valley because of all the biomanufacturing and fermentation that we do in the area. And it is truly a very interesting, innovative opportunity. And a lot of people will say, well, what the heck is biomanufacturing? But it really is taking agricultural waste that is just created because of the growth that we're doing with corn and soybean, rather than have that agricultural waste end up in a landfill. Through innovation, we're able to repurpose it to make yoga pants out of this. I mean, this is a whole new industry of we can replace plastics, we can replace tennis shoes. These are things that are incredible opportunities for us in downstate Illinois because it's location-based. You need to be close to the corn and the soybean growers in order to have the feedstock to actually do biomanufacturing. And we have the great universities in downstate Illinois that are really leading the way in this space. I would say one of the bigger accomplishments we had in the district was President Biden had passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which was really our country's largest reinvestment in American manufacturing in a very long time. As a part of that bill, he designated for tech hubs. There were over 600 applications across the country of tech hubs and great ideas and innovation. And the University of Illinois, Richland Community College, and Parkland Community College, along with our partners at ADM and Primient, collectively put an application together, and we won one of 12. One of the 12 tech hubs, which was a really big deal, $50 million of federal investment in Silicon Valley. And so that has really been a very interesting space. It's a bipartisan space. One of the bills I lead on in the House Ag Committee is called the Bio Act, which is actually basically a small, a low-interest loan for small businesses that are trying to build scalability for their biomanufacturing idea, helping them to incubate ideas and business in our communities. And so I've been working with my Republican colleague, Zach Nunn from Des Moines, Iowa. They grow a lot of corn and soybeans too, on that. And just this year, too, I also became the co-chair of the Biofuels Caucus. So we've been working really hard on year-round E15. How do we grow our biofuels? Again, ethanol is so important to our area. Another bipartisan opportunity. But those are some of the things I've been working on the House Ag Committee. But getting a farm bill done completely would be a really good step, too. Yeah.
And then your other big committee is the Veterans Affairs. And I think you're the ranking member of a subcommittee. So talk about the particular aspects of that you're most focused on.
Yeah, I would say on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I think the two things that we've spent a lot of the time and attention on, one is women veterans. Women veterans are the fastest growing population in our veterans community, and they're the least researched and understood. We don't know why women are exponentially more likely to get breast cancer or ovarian cancer after they've been in active duty. The exposures that they've had to burn pits and things like that have really, I think we've seen the data that it has increased the chances that they are going to develop cancer, but we don't have the research at the VA to know exactly why. We haven't done enough of that. And so I set up, when I got elected, a Veterans Council to hear directly from veterans about their concerns. But because of all of these additional interests as it relates to women veterans, we set up our own Women Veterans Council. One of the issues that I've been really proud and passed unanimously, believe it or not, even in this House, was a bill to support additional training for VA employees when they're working with a veteran that has survived military sexual trauma. Now, of course, that's not just a women veterans issue, that's a male veteran issue as well, but helping to provide more training to deal with military sexual trauma. Our Women's Veterans Council has spent a lot of time talking about the importance of that and really shining a light on some of those issues that I think for a long time really haven't been fully heard. So I've been very proud to be a part of that. The other, I do serve as a ranking member on the Tech and Modernization Subcommittee. That's been a very interesting committee from a perspective of bringing technology and innovation into any of our federal agencies, into our federal government is really challenging. The one big project that this subcommittee has been focused on, and quite frankly has been failing our veterans, is on an electronic health record. That seems very simple. But when you have about 140 different VA hospitals around the country, all operating very independently and differently in their own ecosystems, stitching them all together to create one electronic health record for a veteran. So if they ended up going to Marion, they could then bring, if they needed to go to the big St. Louis VA hospital, that record would transfer. It seems very common sense, but this is something that's very basic that we have not been able to do for our veterans, that this subcommittee is committed to working on. There's a big price tag to it that concerns me, and a lot of that is kind of making sure that these bigger contracts are properly managed so that we're also looking out for taxpayers too. And so that is a kind of a dual role. I look at the work that we do on this subcommittee to look at both of those things.
I know we've been through an abnormal time, but in a more normal time, what would be a typical week? Would you go home 3 out of 4 weekends? Would you fly from Springfield to DC on sort of a Monday night, Tuesday morning for votes? Or what is sort of the structure of your work week?
Yeah, I feel like I don't know that I know normal, but I will say that one of the things I get asked about is like, what surprises you the most about the job? I would tell you the schedule is probably the thing. I mean, the amount of back and forth. I'd say I'm in Washington at least 60% of the time, if not maybe more. It's typically, we have votes on Monday nights, and it usually runs us through Thursday. Sometimes you could catch a Thursday night late flight out, or you leave on Friday, but that leaves you a pretty small window to then be in your district and listening to constituents. Of course, we might have like a longer spring break or something like that where you can spend longer time in your district, but that's kind of atypical. I fly in and out of St. Louis, so I have about an hour and a half drive each way, but I get a direct flight out of Lambert, so that's kind of my back and forth. But most members have a place that they live in Washington, and then we have our homes in our districts, and you maintain both of those. So 2 sets of everything can make travel a little bit more easy, I guess.
Well, let's talk about the Democratic Party now. Since 2024, there has been no shortage of assessments about, what happened, where the Democratic Party is. And it seems there's a lot of discussion about that the party has sort of lost its economic message, that it's perceived as sort of a bi-coastal party that is, driven by elites, and that it's sort of lost touch with working people. Mm-hmm. What do you think, in terms of the Democrats in Congress now? I mean, to what extent is the energy focused on just trying to, slow down President Trump's agenda? To what extent is energy focused on just putting together an agenda that you can take to the people in 26 and 28 and regain some of these votes that have been lost over the last decade or so?
Yeah, those are a lot of great questions. I think I wrote an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune right after the 2024 election, kind of about the path forward. And I think representing and being a Democrat in the most southern district in the state of Illinois that is represented by a Democrat, I have a lot of counties that are very red. Counties that were once blue, like Macoupin County, like Madison County. These were counties that were very blue that have now gone very red. And so I'm not unfamiliar with those kind of conversations. I would use Granite City as a great example of that. I have spent a lot of time fighting for that steel mill represented by the United Steelworkers. It's been a very tough road for a very long time for that mill. But showing up and fighting for that mill to stay opened. I have done that in a number of different ways, calling out U.S. Steel when they've been anxious to kind of leave the community and move down to Arkansas, trying to fight for opportunities to continue to get them to invest, and then, of course, with the sale to Nippon. I've continued to show up and listen, and I think what I put in the op-ed was really to say, Democrats need to continue to show up and listen in all communities, not just in the communities where we think we're going to be well received. And that sometimes there's a kernel of truth to everything. And maybe I think what I would suggest is that the extremes in both parties are one of the biggest challenges as a country, I think, that we're facing. I think most people are somewhere in the middle, and I think, and I would use, honestly, immigration as a good example of that. I have been very critical, or had been very critical, of the way President Biden handled the border. I think that left us vulnerable. I think he should have secured more funding to secure that border. I spoke out on that. I voted in line with that and concerns that I had with that. Now you swing the pendulum all the way to the right, and I would also tell you, I do not in any way agree, nor do I think the constituents I represent largely agree with the way the Trump administration has looked at immigration either, with masked agents, with people being pulled out of child care centers that are just working, that are taxpayers, that are not criminals. And so there needs to be some common sense applied to this. I think somehow getting back to the middle, Democrats showing up in communities where we have work to do, where we once had these voters focusing in on economic, platforms and positions, I think that Democrats need to be able to say what we are for. We need a vision for, if you vote for us, it's not just about this guy is really bad, and so vote for us because we're not as bad. We need to be for what we believe is going to make a person's life better. I think a lot of people just want to make sure that their kids have a better life than what they have. And if the Democrats don't offer a vision for what that looks like, which for me is making sure we have good jobs in our community, making sure we're investing in economic development and opportunity, we're addressing our housing crisis, which is not just a big city issue. Housing is an issue in rural communities. How are we addressing the challenges that we uniquely face in rural communities with healthcare, with our shortages of healthcare professionals and specialists? Democrats have plans to make those investments, but I also think we can't be a party of status quo. We need to realize that change is happening. It's why I'm a part of the New Democrat Coalition, which is the center-left coalition in our caucus. We're putting together policy platforms on what we believe to revitalize our rural communities. Investing in healthcare, investing in workforce, as I said, economic development. It isn't putting tariffs on everything as an economic policy to bring back jobs. And so I just think that as Democrats, what the work is we have between now and November is to make that case. I think immigration with our coalition is a great opportunity for us to lead from the middle on how do we secure our borders, but we create a real pathway to citizenship for people that doesn't take 30 years to enter our country, to fix our broken asylum system. There are so many problems out there, but I think if Democrats can speak to them and how they're going to help people in their everyday life, that's when we're going to start winning again in these red areas and win these areas back, I think.
I'm going to ask you one other question, then we're going to turn it to the audience. But there's been a lot of talk about redistricting now, Texas, California, big battle going on in Indiana. As a member of Congress, what are people saying about this unfolding battle? There's two schools of thought. It's like you got to fight fire with fire. Then there's the Gandhi line, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And, it's just sort of a race to the bottom. But how do you see this redistricting battle that's being played out across the country?
Well, first I would say I support federal legislation at the national level to create a standardized system for us to redraw lines so that they're fair and equitable. But what we have right now is this patchwork system where every state kind of has a choose their own adventure kind of thing and create their own rules. Obviously, we have a supermajority in the state house and the state senate, so the Democrats draw the map. But that's not the case in Missouri or in Indiana. And so I think in the absence of a federal solution to this problem, which I will say, I do think that more competitive districts, like the district that I represent, which is truly a swing district in downstate Illinois, I think that we would be better off as a country. I think it would prevent less of those extremes that I was talking about, and more people that are focused on the center getting elected and serving in Congress. In the absence of that, though, we did as a delegation support redrawing the districts again in Illinois if it came to that. We don't want it to come to that. I think that mid-decade redistricting, quite frankly, is something that the Trump administration was pursuing because they knew they were losing on the issues. If you're winning on the issues, you don't need to cheat. And I really think that doing mid-decade redistricting is just a form of cheating because there's no real reason why Texas needs to redraw its map. And so it backfired on them because you saw what happened was California then did decide to respond. They passed a proposition. It looks very likely we will pick up 5 seats in California. We obviously thought that was just to offset what was happening in Texas, but then last week a judge came down. Actually, I think it was a 3-judge panel, all appointed by Republican presidents, came out and said, no, in fact, the new Texas map is not legal and reverted to the original. So it really backfired for Republicans. I don't know that that's going to be the end of it. In Indiana, it seems like the Republicans have said that they don't want to do the map. They don't want to redistrict. So our governor has said that if that's the case, then we will stand down. So this might be de-escalating, but I do think it just speaks to the fragility of our system, right? And that gerrymandering, I would say money and politics. Those are the two things. I know you had Sherry Bustos here, who is a friend and a mentor as well. And I think those were the two things that she pointed out were big problems in Congress. I would completely echo that. And I think until we can make those changes, we're going to be doing the system as it is. So, which is very hard. And I don't think it serves the American people well.
Okay. I'm going to turn to you in a second, but one thing I want to note, we had Jen Dalby here a couple weeks ago, who runs a Congressional Management Foundation, and they give out awards for excellence in various categories of Congress, and your office won one for overall management excellence. I mean, talk about what, obviously that's a huge honor, but how you try to organize your office and what sort of ethos you try to create.
Well, I have to take this opportunity to acknowledge my team that's in the office. So Yusuf Nexad, who's from Carterville, is my legislative director in Washington, D.C., who does a phenomenal job. I just want to acknowledge and thank him. Gabriella is here, Johns, who's my political director, Nadav Schoenberg, and AJ is on my finance team. So you can't do this job without a great team of people behind you, and it's amazing that we got acknowledged by the Congressional Management Foundation for this work. But any member is only as good as their team, and that's just the true fact of it. I do think from my perspective, it was interesting. I never thought I would run for office. I loved being in public service behind the scenes and serving as a staff member. And that in and of itself is its own public service, of course. So for me, I bring kind of a staff hat to what I do in my own office. You could probably ask Yusuf in particular. That is good and bad on some days. But I hope what that brings is an appreciation for good team, for being collaborative, which I think our team very much is. We like to share ideas. We like to work with others. I do also try to be a very bipartisan member. I know right now it doesn't feel very in vogue to talk about bipartisanship, or maybe it just doesn't seem plausible. But it is, and my team and I, we do work really hard where there are opportunities to work together on issues. We do that on the other side of the aisle. So I think it is about collaboration, fostering growth, and just always continue to keep learning. I think that's really important.
Great. Well, I'd like to open it up to questions. So if you have any questions for Congresswoman.
Thank you. Appreciate your forthrightness. I grew up in a union town in Indiana. We had 30,000 UAW employees there. And I witnessed what you did. Those folks who worked there were able to belong in the middle class, a home, cars, a boat or a camper, and they lived a very comfortable life. Mm-hmm. So I lament the fact that unions such as UAW have shrunk as much as they have. And now I work for the federal government myself, and earlier this year, the administration unilaterally abrogated union contract, and apparently that's happened quite frequently. I was surprised that was legal. Is there something that can be done about that, or is it just wait and see?
Yeah, I think it's 23 different agencies that they've eliminated collective bargaining rights for, but obviously most notably the VA, they've done that. They've also been using that as the opportunity to dismantle a lot of agencies, including the Department of Education, which I think is obviously also very, very troubling. The unions that I know, AFGE and AFSCME, have been suing over, restoring their collective bargaining rights. But I think until we have some kind of a check on this administration and what I believe that first opportunity to be, which is in November, when hopefully we can take the House back for the Democrats, take it back for the people. I think that this administration selectively chooses what court orders they want to listen to or not listen to. It's pretty breathtaking, the swiftness of how quickly they've moved. But I mean, the collective bargaining rights of federal workers, I mean, what's happened to AFGE as a union has been very devastating because of the amount of staff that they've lost, and then their collective bargaining rights as well. So, very challenging, but I've spoken up and signed on to everything and anything I can to support restoring those collective bargaining rights, and I think that's something that we have to get back to immediately when we have the ability to do it. And I think in some ways that's going to lead us into the 2028 election. And what does this next president believe? Do they believe in a federal worker's ability to collectively bargain? I think that's a really important question for those candidates. But what's happening is shocking, and it's all the Project 2025 playbook, basically. They said this, they said they were going to do this, and this administration has definitely done it. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming down. I wanted to know, we just had this shakeup in DC with Marjorie Taylor Greene, apologizing for being, not so nice. And then a week later she says she's going to leave the House. So, obviously it's a very toxic environment there. And, you've talked about how maybe the only way to change anything is to have elections and have more Democrats in there. But do you think any of these Republicans think that what's going on might be wrong? I mean, and that maybe they're just afraid. Are they afraid to say anything? Because you see what happens when somebody does speak up. So.
Yeah, I do think that there is a lot of fear among those in the Republican Party right now to speak out. And you see what happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene with President Trump when she did. So I think that is very real. I would say, though, that in this job, at the end of the day, at least the way I look at it, is all you have is what you see in the mirror when you look in it at the end of the day. And these folks have decided that they're going to vote for the biggest cut to Medicaid in this country's history. They've fallen in line in voting for the deepest, most painful cuts to SNAP that this country has ever seen. And so while I can on one hand acknowledge the political realities that they're faced, which are significant, they're looking at being primaried by an administration that is cruel and punitive. Yes, that is true. But at some point, you do have to ask yourself, how much is your job worth if you're willing to take away health care and children's food and decimate the federal government? At what price does that come to you? So I feel very conflicted because I would tell you, I do talk to some Republicans that we agree on a lot of things, probably, not everything, but on some things where we could find some places to work together. But it's really challenging in this environment where they feel so afraid of stepping out. I do think that the positive, really, outside of Marjorie Taylor Greene leaving Congress, is that there are breaks, there are cracks in the armor. I think that her leaving, what you're seeing is there are others in the Republican conference that are saying there's some truth to what she was saying. And there's a lot of criticism coming down now on Speaker Johnson and the way he has. What should really bother us, among many, many things, is the way that these Republicans have completely abdicated our own equal and separate but equal authority that we have as members of Congress, as the legislative branch in the Constitution. just turning the keys over to this administration without any check or balance. And Speaker Johnson has allowed for it. I mean, it's been quite simply, you want me to jump it, the question is how high. Not ask the hard questions. That's our job to do. It's not to necessarily be difficult, but be difficult when we need to be. And ask the questions that need to be asked, not for us, but for the American people. And the Republicans in the House and largely in the Senate have completely abdicated that responsibility. And so my hope is that with the very thin majority that they have, which now her leaving drops them down another seat, that there will be others that are less fearful for speaking up. I'm very concerned about the economy. I think that the economy is very fragile right now. There's a lot of talk about the AI bubble. I think that's very true. I think that what we learned from President Biden and all the facts and figures about how good the economy was that the economy is a feeling. It's not a number or a statistic. And people right now don't feel like the economy is good for them. And I worry that it's only going to get worse. And the Republicans see this too. And so I think that, my hope is that we can come together. Maybe we can come together and save the ACA tax credits before they expire on December 31st. I know for House Democrats, we take back the House. We haven't had a meeting on this, but I'm sure a lot of what we want to focus on is rolling back some of these horrible cuts to Medicaid and to SNAP that they put into place. And so maybe we will have opportunities to work together with them on those things. Once the fever dream breaks, I don't know.
Hello. I'm over here. Thank you for coming.
Hi.
So I have a son and daughter-in-law, young adults, starting on their military careers as officers. I was very excited for my daughter-in-law, and now I'm terrified for her career in the military under our Secretary of Defense, who is firing women in leadership positions, saying horrible things about military women. Yeah. What do you say to young women who thought they wanted to go into the military, are in the military now? I see a tremendous loss coming forward, because why would you go into the military if you're a woman?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and thank you for their service. I mean, it is not an easy time right now. I think especially for our women that are in active duty. One of the things that, if you haven't followed this with this administration, they've been clawing back money for research and programs that have invested in women and across the board, different constituencies. And they put out a list of things that if your application or your program deals with any of this, they call them trigger words. They will rescind the contract or not give the grant. And some of these words are as simple as female, as equity, as woman. I mean, these are not wild, woke words. These are just helping to serve the people that are serving us. And so it is very, very troubling. I want to say, hang in there. It is not an easy time, but more than ever, and I think about this in my small way in my job, now is the time for good people to try to stick with it and to stay with it and to fight through it. Because when we leave the table or we leave the room, it leaves some really scarier people behind. And I do just think that not giving up and continuing the fight, and I'm saying this not knowing what she's going through every day, the environment and the culture that Secretary Hegseth is creating in what he now refers to as the Department of War is deeply troubling and chilling. The firings that he's doing of top brass, of generals without any any real reason. So it's scary. And then you see what's happening in Venezuela and where all of these things are headed. But I would honestly say, just first thank you for her service, but please stick with us and stick in it, because I do think we are going to get through this. But if we lose all the good people, whether it's in military service, whether it's in civil service, or in public service in any form, it's going to be scarier days ahead. And then that's when they do win. So, not easy. Yeah. Yeah.
So you made reference to the fact that Congress seems to have abdicated its responsibility, and I heard you make reference to that being largely as out of fear for what the president might do to individual congresspeople. But I'm wondering what the president is trying to accomplish is what many in the Republican Party have been trying to accomplish for a long time. And they couldn't accomplish because they couldn't get past the 60-vote hurdle in the Senate.
Right.
So do you think this is one of the reasons why they're just laying back, is because the president is really doing what they want to do but weren't able to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think, I haven't seen polling on this, but I do think that there's something about what President Trump is doing, the effectiveness and the swiftness of how he's moving, that I think I think some people like not all of obviously what he's doing, but the inertia of government and the slowness of government to respond, I think, is frustrating to the American public. So I do think that there are rules like the 60-vote filibuster. A lot of Democrats would argue we should get rid of that because it does hold back some bigger legislation from getting passed. I mean, had it not been for the 60 votes, I mean, people like Senator Manchin or Senator Sinema at the time during the Build Back Better debates would have been less relevant. But then you fast forward to times like this, and the 60-vote threshold has actually probably saved us in a lot of ways. I think given the discipline of this administration and the swiftness of how they were moving, more bad things could have probably happened had it not been for that 60-vote threshold in the Senate. So I do think that this administration is trying to completely sidestep Congress and utilizing executive orders. I think Trump has had, throughout his entire career, a belief that litigation doesn't scare him, so sue him. He's going to just continue to do what he's doing, and a court decides to rule against him. That's fine. He's going to continue to do. I mean, it's a real, that's a real crisis. But I think that, I think that he's been able to utilize the levers of the executive branch in a way that we have not seen a president leverage them, certainly since I've been alive, but I don't know when, maybe FDR was able to do it in a similar fashion. But he's been able to do a lot of the dirty work that Congress hasn't had to get their hands dirty on because he's just been able to move very swiftly. So, yeah.
You mentioned that you were on the House Agriculture Committee, and the fellow who runs my farm makes his living off of cattle. And he was really disturbed when Trump came out and said that the way to solve that problem was to import Argentine beef to bring the price of beef down. He took great exception to that. And so my question, I guess, as a member of that committee, do you allow those kind of comments to influence you in any way in terms of overriding the supply versus demand that has generally been in play to regulate farm commodities over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I very much disagree with the way this administration is pursuing addressing the farm economy. I mean, I think they're creating a crisis that otherwise didn't need to exist. I think one of the things since I've been in office that I've heard the most from my farmers or growers is they want more market access, not less. It's why, I've always supported in the Farm Bill doubling our trade promotion programs, because I think that's so critical to our farmers. But to see that this administration, what they've done with beef in Argentina, the $40 billion, 20 of that is $20 billion of taxpayer dollars given to Argentina, while our growers at that time hadn't had a single soybean sold to China. That showed a level of out of touch that I don't think can be papered over with direct payments. And I think they're, obviously looking, what we understand is that they're looking to provide, they've replenished the CCC, which is something that is a fund the USDA can utilize for direct payments to farmers. They're going to try to utilize that for $10 to $11 billion of support for farmers that are really struggling right now because of their policies. But that's not going to be enough. And it's why we're going to have to get a farm bill done, I think, to make sure that we have the proper safety net in place for farmers during this time. So I meet with my growers a lot, and I hear a lot about what's going on. And they'll tell me they don't want to farm for a direct payment. They want to farm for a market. And I really do believe that. But right now in this environment, it's really impossible to stay afloat. We talk a lot about mental health as a crisis, but one thing we don't talk enough about is the mental health crisis that's happening in our agricultural communities, and with farmers in particular. The suicide rates are so high, and the bankruptcy rates are going up, which contribute to that. And we know that in the first Trump administration, this was small ball trade wars, during the first Trump administration. There were about $27 billion of direct payments that he had to do in his first term. Now he's just talking about a warm-up of $10 to $11 billion. But their farm bankruptcies went up by about 20% in his first term. That's going to be nothing to what we're looking at right now. And what's so heartbreaking is this is of his own making, And I'm somebody who very much believes in fair trade, right? But fair trade can work for farmers. It was working for farmers. And it certainly doesn't make any sense to make an enemy out of a good trading partner like Canada. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with our farm economy in the coming year. Yeah.
Hello, I'm
Hi.
W. Winston Scott. Nice talking with you earlier, and thanks for coming down. I'm a non-traditional undergraduate student in my final year, doing mostly internship at this time. And my cohort just started to apply to graduate school and have started to get accepted. One of the concerns that we have been having is recently there have been a lot of discussion about graduate in professional programs being no longer acknowledged as professional. I was wondering if you could speak to that and share your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, I think we just saw that with nursing as something that is that makes added to the list of things that don't make any sense to me. But I think it's really important when you're looking at professions like social working, like nursing, where we need more people desperately in those professions. We need to honor the professions that they are, which I think means making sure that they continue to have full access to student assistance, financial assistance. We need to be finding ways to incentivize people to be excited to go into those professions. not demonize them or delegitimize them in any way. That's why I don't understand. One of the things I've had the opportunity to do is visit the nursing school at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville to hear about their great nursing program. We have a nursing shortage. We have a teaching shortage in this country. I come from a district that not dissimilar from this area where we don't have enough OBGYNs. We don't have enough mental health providers. These are the professions that we need people to go into. So anything I can be doing to push back on this administration from what they're trying to do, which is ultimately to make student financial assistance more challenging for folks going into these professions to reach, really makes absolutely no sense to me. So my team and I have tried to be looking into that. I have friends that are nurses that have raised the nursing issue with me, but I know it's not just within that profession. And we've flagged it for the committee staff, the labor and education staff, to figure out how we can work together, not just me by myself, but we work together with others to push back on that. So thank you for asking that, though. Yeah.
Maybe one more.
Sure.
Thank you for your scattered comments concerning different patchwork of healthcare. Earlier in your conversation, you mentioned serving on the VA committee and being concerned about the continuity of electronic medical records or women's environmental health and labor issues. And you've subsequently commented on trying to get Medicaid and SNAP and all reinstated after the budget cuts. But working within congressional networks, what is your sense of where the discussion is going on our nation's overall healthcare coverage? Because we have this patchwork. And so you realize, and I'm commenting from someone who's worked in health service quality improvement, health research, health law, and elder care over my life. Where do you see our nation trying to make a more efficient and cost-effective healthcare system for our country?
That's a great question. First, I would just say where I start from is we live in the richest country in the world, and healthcare should be accessible and affordable for everyone. I think that what we have today is a broken system that is breaking even further every day that goes by without some kind of structural change. I think the ACA, when it passed, is still today a landmark piece of legislation that tens of millions of people have had access to health care to because of that marketplace. But what we've seen is over time, and I've noticed in political rhetoric from Republicans, they're trying to chip away. They've been trying to chip away at the ACA since it passed in 2010. And now they're continuing to do that by trying to say, well, see how unaffordable it is now because of premiums being where premiums are. Well, if you go back to when it first passed, during the first Trump administration, it was under his administration that an individual mandate was overturned and not everyone was forced to carry some kind of health insurance. The problem with that for the ACA is you're shrinking the pool of the people, both healthy and not healthy, that are in our healthcare system. The more unhealthy people that are in it and the healthy people being outside of it, that's driving up cost. And so I point that out just to say that where we've gotten to today has been an evolution since well before ACA, but ACA was a big marker. And we need to learn from it and where we need to go from here. So for me, I think that we need to be revisiting things like a public option, an option that is affordable and accessible to everyone. We need more competition in our healthcare system, I think, to bring down costs. I think it isn't just about our premiums, it's also about the ridiculously high costs of prescription drugs, which are too a part of the overall healthcare accessibility for people. If you can get to a doctor but you can't refill or fill your prescription, then why did you go to the doctor in the first place? And so I just think, one of the fights I've had was, and we had a great roundtable with the pharmacy school at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville to take on the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers. When you're talking about how we're lowering the cost of prescription drugs, we need more transparency with these pharmacy benefit managers who are really the middlemen that, in my opinion, are kind of jacking up the prices of prescription drugs in this country. We need to bring down those costs. We need to bring down premiums. But I think that means creating more competition in the market. And that's in the prescription drug arena, but it's also in our health insurance companies as well. And that's why I go back to, I think, a public option, which is just an option on the marketplace that the government would help to run, that would ensure that there's an option out there that is affordable for everyone. If you want to keep your Blue Cross plan, you can do that. But if it's unaffordable, there needs to be an option that's affordable to everybody to pay into. So I think those two things are something that I really look at. But Medicaid is a lifeline in and apart from people that have, health insurance through a marketplace. And when you're talking about long-term care, Medicaid is critical to our seniors being able to live independently and not be moved to institutional settings, for the disability community to, again, live independently. Medicaid is a lifeline for people, and to see that now what is coming is more paperwork requirements in order for them to stay on Medicaid is heartbreaking, because a lot of the folks that I think are struggling to get by to maintain access to health care coverage, what they don't need in their life is just more paperwork to prove that they already have the job that they've had that doesn't afford health insurance, that Medicaid is helping to ensure that they get to their doctor. One of the things that isn't talked about a lot in the big bill is that for Medicaid, you used to have to just apply annually, reapply for access. The Republicans have now made it mandatory for you to apply twice a year to stay on Medicaid. All that does is just create more bureaucracy, and the intended effect is for people to fall away from Medicaid. So if you can't afford the marketplace, if you can't get access to health care through Medicaid, you'll end up in an emergency room, which costs everybody so much more money and just doesn't make any sense. Preventative health care and access to preventative health care is where we can see real cost savings, but that means people being able to afford access to a doctor. So I really believe that Democrats need to be leaning in. We focus so much on the ACA tax credits, which is important right now, but that's not going to solve affordability in our healthcare system. That's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, if you will. I think we need to be looking at real big structural change in this country to make sure that healthcare is accessible for everyone. Yeah.
Great. Well, Nikki, I want to end this way. You've said nice words about Paul Simon, but as you look at kind of the political landscape, is there a political career out there, or maybe even in recent American history, that you really admire and say that person really did it right? They pursued the sort of values that I pursue, or just the way they comported themselves? I guess that's a long way of saying, are there some political role models that you think about as you go forward with your work?
Yeah, I would say someone like Paul Simon is always the first person that kind of comes to mind. I would also say from an elected position, maybe a couple other people. I would definitely say, and I know the last time we saw each other was when Governor Edgar was alive, and we were at the Edgar Fellows program. I'm an Edgar Fellow, which was a bipartisan program that he started at the University of Illinois that brought together Republicans and Democrats. I considered Governor Edgar a friend and a mentor, also a Republican, but somebody who really cared very deeply about the state, and somebody that I think led with a lot of integrity and commitment. And a good example of, we can disagree. He and I would disagree on things, for sure, but we also could find the places where we did agree. And I think, and what I learned from my friendship with him was that we should never give up on that. I think one of the concerns I have in this country is that we've just lost this ability to disagree with each other. It's okay to disagree. We don't need to agree. I don't agree with my family on everything, my friends on everything. I mean, and I think it's just not giving up on trying to find the common ground. I learned that from Governor Edgar, and I very much appreciate that. I've really benefited, though, from two members that are now former members that are from downstate Illinois that I still talk to on a regular basis. I mentioned Congresswoman Sherry Bustos. She's been one of the bigger champions I've had in my career, and we knew each other even before I ran for office. But she has a very practical sense of getting things done, kind of cutting through the BS. I feel like that's what she would say. And then I would also say Congressman Jerry Costello. I represent a large part of what was his former district. And he too, again, a pragmatic, common sense Democrat that was very results driven. I stay focused on delivering for my district. And I think that will hopefully serve me well as I'm running for re-election and then a re-election after that. But those are things that I learned from Jerry and Sherry about staying close to your district, never going DC. I don't think either of them ever did, and stayed committed to their constituents. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming down, and we look forward to having you come back. It's been a really terrific discussion, and I know people here really enjoyed your observations. So thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. Thank you.